There was a time when love had a sound, and that sound came from a man named Luther Ingram. In the dim light of a Memphis studio, his voice carried the ache of truth, the kind that didn't need perfection to be powerful. He sang not to impress, but to confess, and America listened. For a moment, his songs were everywhere, on radios, in smoky bars, and on late-night drives when the world felt too heavy to bear. But when the record stopped spinning and the spotlight moved on, his name began to fade. How does a man who gave so much heart to music become a footnote in its history? Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before the lights, before the fame, there was a small church in Jackson, Tennessee. Inside that little wooden building, a boy named Luther Ingram learned what it meant to feel music before understanding it. His father, Richard Lee Ingram, played the organ at Walnut Grove Baptist Church, while his mother, Callie, led the choir. On Sunday mornings, the sound of gospel filled every crack of the walls, raw, honest, and full of hope. That was where Luther first understood that music wasn't just sound, it was spirit. Born on the 30th of November, 1937, Luther grew up in a world still divided by race but united by rhythm. The South was a hard place for a young black boy with a dream, yet the church gave him shelter. There, among tambourines and call and response chants, he found his first audience. Every hymn was a lesson in emotion, every verse a story of survival. In 1943, he started school at the West Miss Rosenwald School, a place that taught him discipline and patience more than opportunity. But the real education happened after class, listening to radio stations that played Mahalia Jackson, Sam Cooke, and early blues singers whose voices carried both pain and promise. The boy sitting by that old wooden radio didn't know it yet, but he was already learning the language of soul. When Luther was 10, his family packed their few belongings and moved north to Alton, Illinois, in search of a better life. The new city was colder, but the streets hummed with possibility. Factories, jazz clubs, and gospel halls, a melting pot of sound. It was there that Luther and his 5 brothers and 1 sister formed a family singing group called the Midwest Crusaders. They sang at local churches and community events, blending faith with harmony. It wasn't about money, it was about belonging. By the time he finished high school in Alton, Luther had already set his eyes on something bigger. In 1956, at the age of 19, he became the lead singer for a local street Louis group called the Gardenias. They were signed to Federal Records, a small label with big dreams. Those were the years of smoky clubs, cheap microphones, and long nights of waiting for a break that never seemed to come. But Luther never lost faith. His voice, smooth yet gritty, had the kind of honesty that couldn't be taught. As a teenager, he started writing songs, not just singing them. His lyrics were stories from the streets, reflections of struggle and desire. He wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing understanding. That hunger would become the foundation of everything he did later. By the late 1950s, he was performing solo, opening for acts like Ike Turner in East St. Louis. Those nights were electric. The sound of brass, sweat, and laughter filled the air. Ingram would walk on stage wearing his best suit, not because he had to, but because he believed music deserved respect. The crowd might not have known his name, but they remembered his voice. It carried something ancient, something deeply human. It was during those years that Luther learned one of the hardest lessons in music talent wasn't enough. You had to survive the waiting. He wrote between gigs, rehearsed when he could, and recorded demos that often went nowhere. Yet even in silence, his persistence grew stronger. He once said that when he couldn't afford to record, he'd write songs in his head until he fell asleep. The 1,960 were calling a decade of revolution, of new sounds and new voices. Luther could feel that the world was shifting, and he didn't want to be left behind. He dreamed of New York City, the place where dreams were made and broken in the same breath. The thought of leaving everything behind scared him, but he knew he had to go. His heart was too restless for small-town stages. Before he left Alton, he met a woman named Jacqueline Langford. She was educated, elegant, and believed in him when few others did. They married in 1961, promising each other a future that was anything but certain. That union would become his anchor through years of instability and rejection. When he finally boarded that bus to New York, Luther wasn't just chasing fame, he was chasing freedom. Behind him lay the fields of Tennessee and the church pews of his youth. Ahead, the unknown streets of a city that didn't wait for anyone. He arrived with a suitcase, a notebook full of unfinished lyrics, and a voice that carried the echo of the South. He didn't know it yet, but those humble beginnings, the hymns, the nights in Alton, the lessons from his father's church, would become the soul of every note he would ever sing. Because before the legend, before the heartbreak, before the world even knew his name, there was just a boy standing at the edge of a dream, and he was ready to take the first step. New York was louder than anything Luther Ingram had ever known. The horns, the subways, the constant rush. It was a city that never gave you permission to rest. But for a young man from Tennessee with a notebook full of songs, that chaos was music itself. He arrived in the early 1960s, carrying little more than belief. His dream wasn't about fame or riches. It was about being heard. At first, New York didn't notice him. He performed in small bars across Harlem and Brooklyn, sometimes singing to a handful of people who weren't really listening. But Luther had something they couldn't ignore, that deep, unfiltered emotion that made his voice sound like it had lived 1,000 lives. Word began to spread. Musicians started to take notice of the quiet man who sang like his heart was breaking and healing all at once. By 1965, Luther signed a deal with Decca Records. It wasn't a big contract, but it was his first real chance to make a mark. That same year, he released You Never Miss Your Water. The song didn't climb the charts the way he hoped, but it carried a kind of sincerity that critics remembered. It spoke of regret, longing, and love that slips through your fingers, themes that would follow him throughout his career. It was Luther's first whisper to the world, a prelude to everything that would come. Music wasn't the only thing shaping his life in those years. In 1961, he had married Jacqueline Langford, a strong and graceful woman from O'Fallon, Illinois. She had graduated from Columbia College in St. Louis and believed in his gift even when the industry didn't. Their marriage wasn't built on glamour, but on quiet loyalty. When the rent was late and the gigs were scarce, she reminded him why he started. She would say, "You don't sing for them, Luther. You sing because you have to." Ingram spent nights writing, reworking melodies, and sharing small studios with other struggling artists. According to legend, for a short time, he even shared a room with a young guitarist named Jimi Hendrix, two dreamers chasing light in the same city. The stories from that time blur between fact and folklore, but what remains clear is that both men were burning with the same hunger to be seen. By the late 1960s, Luther realized that New York's promises came at a cost. The city was full of talent, but only a few ever broke through. He began looking south again toward Memphis, where soul music was rising, where Stax Records was redefining the sound of America. The move wasn't just about opportunity. It was about finding his place among people who spoke the same musical language, gospel, grit, and groove. When he finally left New York, it wasn't failure that drove him away. It was faith. He believed there was something waiting for him in the South, something more authentic, something that would let him sing the way he felt. Memphis was a city built on emotion, not polish. And for Luther, that meant everything. In Memphis, he found a home with producer Jimmy Baylor and the fledgling Coco label. It was there that he started shaping a sound that felt truly his own, tender yet defiant, sorrowful yet strong. His 1,967 single, I Can't Stop, didn't make waves, but it carried a spark. Critics called it raw, honest, and haunting. It was as if Luther was carving his name into the edges of soul music, one line at a time. Behind the scenes, he was writing relentlessly, experimenting with lyrics that blended heartbreak and hope. He understood that pain could be melodic, that sometimes the truest songs came from silence. Every track he recorded during that period sounded like a man searching for something he couldn't quite name. Then, in 1969, his patience paid off. Coco struck a distribution deal with Stax Records, one of the most influential soul labels in the country. Suddenly, Luther's songs had reach. That year, he released My Honey and Me, his first R&B top 20 success. It climbed to number 55 on the Billboard Hot 100 and stayed there for 12 weeks. It wasn't a massive hit, But for Luther, it was validation. After years of quiet struggle, he finally had proof that people were listening. That same year, he released Ain't That Loving You, which became an R&B top 10 hit and nearly crossed into the mainstream top 40. His name began appearing in music magazines, his face on posters across Memphis and St. Louis. But beneath the growing attention, Luther remained humble. He still carried himself like the boy from the church choir, grateful, grounded, and quietly determined. Every artist has a moment when the world finally begins to echo back what they've been shouting into the dark. For Luther, this was that moment. But instead of celebrating, he went back to work. He believed that true recognition didn't come from the charts, it came from the songs themselves. By the end of the decade, he was more than a singer. He was becoming a storyteller, a craftsman, and soon one of the most gifted songwriters soul music would ever know. And just around the corner, his pen was about to write something that would change the sound of an entire generation. By 1971, Luther Ingram had found his rhythm not in fame, but in purpose. He had learned that the soul of a song didn't come from notes, it came from truth. Memphis had given him space to breathe, to write, to rediscover the gospel heartbeat that raised him. And then, in that small studio filled with cigarette smoke and hope, he met fellow musician Mac Rice. That meeting would change everything. The two men talked about what was happening around them, America still aching from the civil rights era, people searching for dignity in a divided country. Out of those conversations came a song that wasn't about love or heartbreak, but something far deeper: Respect Yourself. They wrote it as a reminder, not a sermon. Luther's melody carried the weight of the streets, while Mac's lyrics struck like a quiet protest. It said, "If you don't respect yourself, no one else will." Simple words, powerful truth. The Staple Singers recorded it later that year, and suddenly, that message echoed from churches to radio stations all across the nation. The record climbed toward the top of the charts, and for once, the sound of empowerment had a rhythm. Respect Yourself wasn't just a song, it was a movement. It made people look in the mirror and remember their worth. And at the heart of it all stood Luther Ingram, the quiet man behind the melody, proud but humble, smiling from the shadows. The success brought attention he'd never had before. Producers began to see him not only as a singer but as a craftsman, a man who could translate pain into poetry. Yet Luther didn't change. He still carried himself with the calm of someone who knew fame could vanish faster than a final note. He stayed focused on the music, not the noise around it. Then, in 1972, came the song that defined his career, If Loving You Is Wrong, I Don't Want to Be Right. Written by Homer Banks, Raymond Jackson, and Carl Hampton, it was a story of forbidden love, one torn between desire and guilt. For most singers, it would have been just another ballad. For Luther, it was a confession. When he stepped up to the microphone, everything he had lived, faith, struggle, loss, came pouring out. The take was raw, haunting, and perfect. The moment he finished, the room went silent. Everyone in that studio knew they had just heard something that would outlive them all. When the song hit the airwaves, America stopped to listen. It reached number 3 on the pop charts, sold over 1 million copies, and became one of the most powerful soul ballads of the decade. Even Barbara Mandrell, a country star, covered it years later, proof that emotion has no boundaries. But for Luther, the numbers didn't matter. He said once that he sang, not to be right, but to be real. That was his truth. He didn't chase perfection, he chased honesty. By the end of that year, Luther Ingram was finally where he belonged, in the heart of the music he loved, surrounded by people who finally understood the quiet force of his voice. But even as applause grew louder, part of him stayed still, remembering where it all began, a boy in a Tennessee church, learning that real power doesn't come from fame, it comes from soul. And that soul had just found its place in history. By 1972, Luther Ingram had finally reached the place every artist dreams of, that fleeting moment when the world truly listens. His single, If Loving You Is Wrong, I Don't Want to Be Right, was more than just a hit, it was a revelation. Across America, people stopped what they were doing when his voice came on the radio. There was something haunting about it, tender, broken, and fearless all at once. The song didn't just tell a story, it exposed one. It spoke for anyone who had ever loved someone they weren't supposed to, for anyone who had ever chosen emotion over judgment. Luther didn't sing as an observer, he sang as if he'd lived every word. That honesty turned the record into a cultural event. It climbed to number 3 on the Billboard pop chart, sold over 1 million copies, and earned him invitations to perform on stages that had once seemed unreachable. But fame never sat comfortably on Luther's shoulders. While others dressed their success in gold chains and spotlight smiles, he carried his with quiet grace. He wasn't chasing the flash of celebrity, he was chasing the feeling of connection. In interviews, he often said that a song only mattered if it made people feel less alone. And for a while, that's exactly what his music did. In those years, he became a symbol of sincerity in an industry that often preferred glamour to truth. His voice, heavy with experience, could turn any lyric into something sacred. "I'll be your shelter in time of storm" became another standout, a promise wrapped in melody. Fans heard in it the same warmth that made "If Loving You Is Wrong" unforgettable, a voice that offered comfort even when it was breaking. Backstage, Luther was known for his calm energy. Other performers described him as a man who never rushed, never bragged, and never forgot where he came from. While audiences saw the polished singer under stage lights, those close to him still saw the boy from Jackson, Tennessee, the one who used to sing gospel beside his mother's piano. That humility made people love him even more. As the decade unfolded, Luther's music defined what R&B ballads could be: emotional without exaggeration, sensual without spectacle. His performances weren't about power, they were about presence. He didn't belt, he confessed, and that intimacy made his songs linger long after they ended. Critics compared his emotional delivery to legends like Otis Redding and Al Green, yet Luther remained distinct, softer, subtler, but just as deep. Where others shouted pain, he whispered it. Where others performed, he felt. That quiet distinction became his signature. But behind the glow of success, the cracks had already begun to form. His label, Coco Records, was struggling financially. Distribution issues, management disputes, and the shifting tides of the music industry all began to close in. Luther kept recording, pouring heart into songs like "You Were Made for Me" and "Love Ain't Gonna Run Me Away," but without proper backing, even great music could vanish into silence. For now, though, in the mid-1970s, his voice was still everywhere in jukeboxes, nightclubs, and car radios, drifting through humid summer nights. It was the sound of vulnerability, of truth set to rhythm. Luther Ingram had given the world his heart, and for a brief, shining moment, the world gave him its attention. At the height of his fame, Luther Ingram seemed untouchable. His songs played on radios across America, his name appeared in magazines, and audiences filled theaters to see the man whose voice had turned pain into poetry. But behind the applause, something quieter was happening, something that would slowly pull him away from the very light he had fought to reach. Coco Records, the small label that had carried him to success, was beginning to fall apart. The industry was changing fast. Major labels were taking control of distribution, radio trends were shifting toward disco and funk, and independent soul artists like Luther were left fighting for survival. Even with a gold record on his wall, he couldn't escape the cracks in the business that had made him. He tried to hold things together. Through the mid-1970s, he released singles that should have been hits: "You Were Made for Me," "Do You Love Somebody," "I'll Just Call You Honey," and "Love Ain't Gonna Run Me Away." Each one carried his signature blend of honesty and warmth, but without proper promotion, they were lost in the noise of a crowded market. To the public, it looked as if he had vanished. To Luther, it felt like being invisible again. Fame, he learned, was never permanent. One year the crowd chanted your name, the next they barely remembered your face. Still, he kept performing smaller venues now, more intimate, where his songs reached people one heart at a time. He didn't need arenas, he needed connection. On stage, under dim lights, he would close his eyes and sing as if the world had stopped listening, but he refused to stop speaking. Those who saw him during those years remember a man who carried both peace and sadness. He would arrive early to rehearsals, always polite, always calm. Between takes, he'd hum melodies under his breath, fragments of songs that never made it to record. There was no bitterness in him, only reflection. "The industry changes," he once told a friend, "but feelings don't." By the late 1970s, Luther's voice remained strong, but his opportunities grew scarce. The rise of disco pushed soul music to the margins, and the deep emotional style that once defined him was now considered old-fashioned. The irony was cruel. The same honesty that made him timeless was now the reason radio moved on without him. Yet, there was dignity in his silence. He didn't chase trends or reinvent himself for approval. Instead, he stayed true to the sound that had carried him from a church in Tennessee to stages across the country. In that quiet defiance, he preserved something few artists ever do: authenticity. Behind closed doors, though, the toll was real. Financial troubles mounted. The dream that once lifted him began to feel heavy, but Luther never lost faith in the music itself. He used to say that every note he sang was a prayer not for success but for peace. And while the industry began to forget, the people didn't. Somewhere in a bar, jukebox, a record still spun. Somewhere in a kitchen, a couple still slow danced to If Loving You Is Wrong. His voice had already become part of people's lives, even if they no longer remembered the man behind it. By the time the 1980 decade arrived, the world of soul music had changed. The smooth, heartfelt sound that once ruled the airwaves was now being pushed aside by disco, funk, and a growing pop scene that left little room for reflection. For Luther Ingram, a man whose voice lived in the quiet spaces between pain and grace, this new world felt unfamiliar. Coco Records, the small label that had carried his dreams, was crumbling. The business side of music, contracts, distribution, politics began to swallow the passion that once defined him. He watched younger artists rise on the same stages he used to fill, while his own records struggled to find radio play. You Were Made for Me, Do You Love Somebody, I'll Just Call You Honey. Each song held his signature soul, yet they drifted into silence before reaching the hearts they deserved. Fame, he learned, was fragile. It didn't vanish all at once. It slipped away quietly, like a record slowing to its final spin. For years, Luther had poured his heart into his music, believing that sincerity would always find a home. But the industry had become colder, faster, and less forgiving. Still, he refused to surrender. He continued writing, recording, and performing wherever there was a microphone and a willing audience. Small clubs across Memphis, Street, Louis, and Chicago became his new sanctuaries. The crowds were smaller, but their connection was deeper. When he sang, If Loving You Is Wrong, time seemed to stop. Strangers who didn't even know his name felt the ache in his words. To those who met him in those years, Luther was both serene and sorrowful. He carried himself with quiet dignity, polite, soft-spoken, never bitter. Backstage, he would hum melodies between sets, lost in thought. One musician recalled seeing him pause before a show, eyes closed, whispering, "All I ever wanted was to be heard." It wasn't a complaint, it was a prayer. His marriage to Jacqueline became his anchor. She had been with him since the beginning, through the highs, the touring, and now the uncertainty. She kept him steady, reminding him that legacy wasn't built on headlines, but on honesty. Together, they weathered the storms that success had left behind. In 1986, a glimmer of hope returned. Luther signed with Profile Records and released Baby Don't Get Too Far, a song that brought him back to the R&B top 40. It wasn't a major comeback, but it was a spark proof that the soul still lived. For a brief time, his name reappeared on radio playlists, his voice once again filling late-night airwaves. But the spotlight didn't last. The industry had moved on, and Luther refused to chase trends. He stayed true to his sound, pure, timeless, unpolished. When the offers began to fade again, he accepted it with the same humility that had carried him from a Tennessee church to national fame. The crisis of his career wasn't loud or tragic. It was quiet, the kind that only artists feel when their purpose no longer matches the world around them. But even in that silence, Luther never stopped believing in the power of song. Because for him, music was never about success. It was about faith. And faith, unlike fame, never fades. After the small revival of 1986, Luther Ingram's voice began to fade from the airwaves again, not because it lost its beauty, but because the world no longer made space for voices like his. The rise of electronic sounds and youth-driven trends left little room for soul singers who built their art on sincerity. For an artist who sang from the heart, it was a quiet kind of heartbreak. He continued to perform throughout the late 1980 decade, mostly in small venues, lounges, community theaters, and local festivals. There were no more flashing lights, no more magazine covers. Yet, every night when he walked on stage, something sacred happened. As the first note escaped his lips, people remembered. They might not have known his name, but they knew the feeling. The room always fell silent when he sang, "If loving you is wrong, I don't want to be right." That song had outlived the fame that created it. But behind the scenes, the years were taking their toll. Financial struggles, exhaustion, and a body worn down from decades on the road began to weigh heavily on him. His health started to falter. By the early 1990 decade, Luther was diagnosed with renal disease, and soon after, diabetes. Doctors advised him to rest, but rest never came easy to a man who only felt alive when he was singing. In 1992, he recorded one final song, "I Like the Feeling," with the Etc. band. It didn't chart or reach radio, but it carried the same warmth and humanity that had always defined him. It was Luther's way of saying goodbye without saying the words. The melody felt like a sigh, tender, honest, and peaceful. He never made another official recording again. Away from the stage, his world became quieter. He spent most of his time at home with his wife Jacqueline, who remained by his side through every storm. Friends who visited said his house was filled with old records, Sam Cooke, Ray Charles, and his own vinyls, now worn and scratched with time. Sometimes he would sit in silence, listening to the crackle of the needle and saying softly, "That's the sound of life, imperfect, but still beautiful." Even in his illness, he never complained. He accepted his struggles the way he accepted applause humbly. He told a friend, "I didn't get everything I wanted, but I got to sing what I felt. That's enough." It was a simple truth from a man who had lived through the full circle of fame from spotlight to shadow. On the 19th of March 2007, Luther Ingram passed away from heart failure at the age of 69. There were no major headlines, no televised tributes. But somewhere, on an old jukebox in Memphis, one of his songs kept playing. Somewhere, a fan still sang along to his voice, not realizing that the man who gave life to it was gone. Luther's end wasn't filled with tragedy or spectacle. It was gentle, like a curtain closing after a performance that moved everyone but was never fully seen. He left the world the same way he lived in it, quietly, gracefully, with his soul intact. And in that silence, his music still spoke, reminding us that even when the world forgets, the truth inside a song never dies. When Luther Ingram passed in 2007, it felt like the closing of a quiet chapter, but not the end of his story. His songs had already escaped time. They continued to live in the corners of memory where true music never dies. For those who listened, his voice was more than a sound. It was a feeling, the kind that lingered long after the last note faded. In the years that followed, fans began to rediscover him not through grand tributes or documentaries, but through the small, timeless ways people remember. Old vinyl collectors started trading his albums again. Local radio stations dedicated late-night slots to his love ballads. And on the internet, listeners shared clips of "If loving you is wrong, I don't want to be right," marveling at how raw and real it still felt decades later. For many, Luther's music became a reminder of what R&B once was: honest, spiritual, and human. His songs carried imperfection like a badge of truth. In an age when production grew cleaner and hearts grew guarded, his voice reminded people that pain could be beautiful too. His legacy wasn't just in what he sang, but in what he helped create. The song "Respect Yourself," co-written with Mac Rice, remains one of the most enduring anthems of empowerment in American music. Its message of self-worth still resonates in schools, in church halls, in protests, in quiet moments when someone needs to be reminded of their own dignity. Artists across generations, from Bruce Willis to Joe Cocker, would cover it, each adding their voice to the message Luther helped bring into the world. Even If Loving You Is Wrong found new life through countless interpretations, from Barbara Mandrell's country rendition to contemporary soul singers who admired its emotional honesty. The song crossed boundaries of genre, race, and age. Few artists have ever managed to speak to so many hearts in so many different languages of feeling. But beyond charts and covers, Luther's influence could be heard in the voices that came after him. Singers like Luther Vandross, Barry White, and even younger artists of the neo-soul era drew from the emotional depth that men like Ingram made possible. He had proven that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that a man could confess, could ache, could love openly without shame. That truth changed soul music forever. Musicians who worked with him remembered not just his voice, but his spirit. He was never the loudest in the room, but he was always the most present. He believed that music was a conversation with God, one that didn't need perfection, only sincerity. "You don't have to be great," he once said. "You just have to be real." That belief became the thread that tied every note he ever sang. In a world that often forgets its quiet heroes, Luther Ingram's story endures because of what it represents, the beauty of authenticity. His songs still speak to anyone who has ever loved deeply, lost quietly, or stood between right and wrong and chosen to feel anyway. He may not have a star on Hollywood Boulevard, but his voice became one shining softly, endlessly, for those who still listen. Long after Luther Ingram was gone, the world began to remember him in the way it often remembers its quietest legends, slowly, softly, with reverence. There were no parades, no primetime specials. But among true lovers of music, his name began to rise again like an old song rediscovered in the attic. It wasn't nostalgia alone that brought him back. It was recognition, the understanding that what he gave to music was real, and real things never disappear. In America, music historians started revisiting the era of Southern soul, tracing its emotional roots back to voices like Ingram's. They spoke of how his work bridged gospel's honesty with R&B's sensuality, creating a space where both could exist without contradiction. Writers called him the conscience of soul, a man who dared to sing not about perfection, but about humanity. It was a title he never asked for, but one he earned with every note. Independent radio hosts and collectors began featuring his songs in retrospectives, placing him alongside the greats Otis Redding, Isaac Hayes, Al Green. And though he never reached their commercial fame, he shared something deeper with them: truth. They all came from the same soil, the same churches, the same humble stages where music was prayer and rhythm was survival. Luther's story reminded people that every legend stands on the shoulders of those who sang before and after them. Beyond America, his influence reached quietly into corners of the world that understood heartbreak as a universal language. In Europe and Japan, where vinyl collecting became a cultural art form, his records turned into prized possessions. DJs and soul enthusiasts began spinning his tracks at vintage nights, calling him the voice that time forgot. Each time If Loving You Is Wrong played, a room full of strangers fell into the same silence that once filled American living rooms decades earlier. Younger generations discovered him through digital archives and YouTube uploads. Comments poured in beneath the videos, not from critics, but from ordinary listeners who found pieces of their own stories in his voice. Some wrote, "My mother used to play this song while cooking dinner." Others said, "I just found him today, and I can't stop listening." In the quiet corners of the internet, Luther Ingram was being reintroduced to a world ready to feel again. In the United States, cities like Memphis and St. Louis held small tributes, intimate gatherings where musicians played his songs live, sharing stories about how his music had shaped their journeys. These weren't grand ceremonies. They were humble, heartfelt moments, fitting for a man who had never sought the spotlight. Every generation needs artists who remind them what honesty sounds like. Luther was one of those artists. His career may have faded, but his message never did. That love, pain, and truth all come from the same place. Today, when his voice resurfaces on old playlists or late-night radio, it doesn't sound dated. It sounds alive, a pulse from another time that still beats inside the hearts of those who listen. Because some voices don't belong to an era. They belong to eternity. And Luther Ingram's voice is one of them, the kind you don't forget, even after the music stops. There's a moment, somewhere between silence and song, where truth lives. That's where Luther Ingram's voice still lingers. It doesn't need to shout to be heard, it just needs a quiet room, a still heart, and a listener willing to feel. He once stood under the same spotlight that made legends. He sang about the kind of love that breaks rules, the kind of faith that survives failure, the kind of soul that refuses to disappear. And even when the world stopped paying attention, he never stopped being real. That was his gift and his quiet rebellion. For every artist who has been forgotten, Luther's story reminds us that recognition isn't the same as legacy. Fame can fade, But truth endures. His songs were made from it. If Loving You Is Wrong wasn't just a confession of desire, it was a portrait of humanity. Respect Yourself wasn't just an anthem, it was a reflection of dignity. And somewhere between those two messages lies everything Luther ever stood for: love, honesty, and self-respect. It's easy to think of history as a collection of winners and losses, of names remembered and names erased. But real history is made of the voices that stay with us even when the credits roll. Luther's was one of those voices. He sang for people who never made the headlines, who carried their pain quietly, who loved without apology. In his music, they found themselves imperfect, unguarded, and free. So tonight, maybe you'll hear one of his songs again. Maybe it will play softly in a cafe or on a radio at dusk, and you won't even realize who it is at first, but you'll feel it, that warmth, that ache, that truth. That's Luther Ingram, reminding us that soul music was never just about rhythm, it was about the human heart. His story isn't just a memory, it's a mirror. Because every one of us has known what it feels like to love something the world forgot. And that's what keeps Luther's voice alive, not fame, not money, but the quiet devotion of those who still remember. Do you think Hollywood, or the music industry, ever gave Luther Ingram the respect he truly deserved? If his story moved you, let his music live again. Play his songs, share them, keep them in the world, because remembrance is the greatest applause a legend can ever receive. And as the last note fades, one truth remains. Some stars never vanish, they just shine where fewer eyes can see. If you ever loved Luther Ingram, leave a message for him in the comment. Subscribe to the channel and help us keep Hollywood's forgotten legends alive, one story, one voice, one memory at a time.